He told her their marriage was nothing but a deal, a paper shield to protect his empire. But on a stormy island, one forbidden night shattered every rule he ever made. And when she whispered she was pregnant, the Mafia boss realized the one thing he couldn't control was his own heart. Mira Vargos had always believed her life was a tapestry of choices, each thread carefully chosen by her own hands. But the night her father's business collapsed, she realized life had been quietly weaving a pattern she could neither see nor control. Panic had gripped her family like a frozen hand. Her father, once proud and unyielding, now wandered their once grand home with hollow eyes and whispered apologies. The whispers weren't just for him, they were for her, for the world, for the truth she refused to admit. They were ruined. Amid this storm of desperation, Klassen Vargo appeared as if conjured from some dark, untouchable realm. He was a man whose name carried weight across continents, whose reputation bent both fear and respect into perfect harmony. Cold, sharp, and untouchable, he entered their lives not with sympathy, but with a proposition that chilled Mira to the bone. Her father's eyes, desperate and pleading, turned to her, seeking a solution, any solution. Klassen's terms were simple, brutal, and impossibly cruel. Her hand in marriage, in exchange for the salvation of her father's crumbling empire. "You'll get security," Klassen said, his voice smooth and commanding, each word weighted like steel. "I'll get protection. Nothing more." There was no room for negotiation, no space for feelings, and certainly no hint of softness. Mira stared at him, her heart twisting in a mixture of fear, disgust, and the faintest spark of curiosity. How could anyone so feared, so untouchable, make such a proposition without it being a trap? But desperation had a way of bending morals and dreams alike. The weeks that followed were a blur of preparation, paperwork, and whispered instructions. The wedding itself was nothing short of a spectacle, lavish beyond reason, filled with gilded decorations, sparkling chandeliers, and cameras placed strategically as if the entire world had a right to witness the transaction. Mira walked through the grand hall, her dress heavy with fabric and societal expectation. Each step echoed like a sentence in a trial she had never agreed to. Guests smiled, raised glasses, and whispered congratulations, but none of it touched the raw wound festering inside her. She was no bride, she was currency. Klassen remained distant, impeccably poised, a shadow of elegance and menace wrapped in a tailored suit. His eyes, dark and unreadable, rarely met hers, and when they did, Mira felt an uncomfortable awareness prick at her skin. There was power in his gaze, yes, but there was also an icy detachment that made her feel less than human, more like a puzzle piece being fit into a plan she had never wanted to join. As the ceremony progressed, each vow was spoken not from the heart, but from necessity. Mira's voice trembled despite her efforts, a fragile note of resistance buried beneath layers of obligation. Klassen's hand brushed hers during the exchange, a gesture that should have held warmth or promise, yet instead carried only the weight of inevitability. "This marriage is just a deal," he whispered so quietly that only she could hear, his breath brushing against her lips, a faint warning wrapped in cold certainty. Mira's chest tightened. She wanted desperately to believe him. She wanted to accept that nothing more would be demanded of her heart. Yet despite his words, she felt something shift, a fleeting, almost imperceptible hesitation in his grip, a subtle flicker of tension in the line of his jaw. And then, before she could blink, his hand lingered a second too long, the brush of skin against skin betraying a truth he did not yet understand himself. Her mind raced, refusing logic. Was it possible for a man like Klassen, Vargo, to harbor even a fragment of humanity? Or was it merely a trick, a brief crack in the armor of a man who feared vulnerability above all else? Mira wanted to retreat, to step back and remind herself that this was a deal, a calculated exchange, nothing more. But some part of her, the part that remembered warmth and laughter in simpler times, clung to the fleeting human flicker she had glimpsed in those unguarded moments. The reception was no refuge. Cameras flashed with relentless intensity, capturing every forced smile, every stiff dance step. Guests whispered praises and assumptions about the perfect couple, and yet Mira felt hollow with every congratulatory word. She danced with a practiced smile, her body moving while her mind spun with questions about the man beside her. Klassen's presence was magnetic, commanding attention even when he did not seek it, yet simultaneously alienating, as if a wall had been erected around his soul that no one could scale. During the evening, a minor mishap occurred. A servant tripped near the dessert table, spilling wine onto the pristine white carpet. Klassen's reaction was immediate and startling. A hand shot out, steadying the trembling server before she even realized what happened. Mira's eyes widened. Beneath the mask of the untouchable Mafia boss, there existed a man who noticed, who reacted, who felt. It was a tiny moment, insignificant to the world, yet monumental in the quiet spaces of her heart. Later, in a private corridor leading away from the crowded hall, Mira paused, gathering her thoughts in the dim light. Klassen followed silently, his steps precise and deliberate. She sensed his presence more than she saw it, the air charged with unspoken tension. "You shouldn't wander alone," he said finally, voice low, dangerous, yet tinged with an emotion she could not identify. "I wasn't wandering," Mira replied, so steady but cautious. "I was moving through a crowd I didn't belong to." Her words were sharp, defensive, a shield against the vulnerability that threatened to break her composure. He studied her, eyes narrowing, unreadable as ever. "Be careful what you call belonging," he said, a faint shadow of something, interest, curiosity, passing across his face before he masked it again. Mira shivered despite herself, unsure whether the fear or the intrigue was stronger. The night stretched on, a blur of orchestrated perfection and silent undercurrents. Mira found herself standing alone on a balcony, looking out over the sprawling estate. The moonlight glimmered across the manicured gardens, painting shadows that danced like specters. She thought of her father, crumpled and defeated, of the life they had lost, and of the future now bound to a man she barely understood. Footsteps approached, measured and deliberate. Klassen appeared beside her, the night air brushing against his sharp features. "Do you regret it?" he asked, voice almost softer than before, a nuance that made Mira catch her breath. "I regret nothing," she said quickly, though her heart contradicted her words. "I am merely aware of the cost." "And the cost?" His tone was probing, yet careful, as though testing boundaries she hadn't even realized existed. She looked away, gazing into the distant horizon. "Everything," she admitted, barely above a whisper. The admission hung between them, unspoken and fragile, an invisible thread connecting two people who should remain strangers. Klassen remained silent for a long moment, watching her. Then, as if compelled by some unacknowledged force, his hand brushed against hers once again. This time it was lighter, hesitant, but deliberate. The contact sent a ripple through Mira, a confusing mixture of hope and fear. Was this merely a courtesy, a controlled gesture to Mai, and in appearances? Or was it something more, something neither dared acknowledge aloud? In that brief touch, Mira glimpsed a crack in his carefully constructed facade, a flicker of the human beneath, the monster. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, yet it was enough to ignite a storm inside her chest. Her pulse quickened, and for a single heartbeat, she allowed herself to imagine a world where this deal might not define her entirely. The evening ended with applause and farewells, the world outside celebrating a marriage that existed only on paper. Mira retreated to her room, exhaustion weighing on her body and mind, yet sleep eluded her. Questions circled relentlessly. Could she trust him? Could she trust herself? And that lingering, terrifying thought, what if the deal was already breaking, before it even began? As she lay in the soft, gilded bed, the veil of the wedding still clinging to her hair, Mira felt the first stirrings of something she could not name. Fear, yes. Anger, certainly. But beneath it all, a fragile, dangerous curiosity, a desire to know the man behind the cold mask, to see if the flicker of humanity she had glimpsed would grow or vanish entirely in the shadows of Klassen Vargo's world. And somewhere in the quiet of that gilded room, the faintest trace of a smile tugged at his lips. A man who had never smiled for anyone, yet perhaps, for the first time, had allowed himself to wonder about the impossible, a connection that went beyond deals, contracts, and power. Mira drifted into a restless sleep, the moonlight spilling across her face, shadows dancing like promises yet to be broken. Outside, the world celebrated a union that was supposed to be strategic, predictable, and sterile. But inside those walls, the rules had already begun to bend. And somewhere, deep inside both of them, a dangerous spark had ignited. One neither would yet admit, but one that could not be denied. The night ended, but the questions remained. Would this marriage remain a cold transaction, or would the first threads of something unthinkable begin to weave between two? Him? Mira could not know. Klassen would not reveal, and the world, blissfully unaware, continued to celebrate a deal that was already beginning to fracture. Morning arrived over the Vargo estate like a quiet, indifferent observer, spilling pale light across the cold marble floors and gilded corridors. Mira stirred under the weight of heavy silks and the echoes of last night's questions, her mind restless, her heart still thrumming with the tension she could not name. The mansion, with its high ceilings and endless corridors, seemed alive yet oppressive, each shadow hiding both mystery and menace. It was not a home. It was a cage wrapped in grandeur, a gilded prison where freedom came only in small, stolen breaths. Mira rose carefully, moving through the room in silence. The servants were precise, invisible yet present, moving like ghosts trained to anticipate her needs before she spoke them. She dressed meticulously, her reflection in the ornate mirror betraying her fatigue. Her eyes, bright yet tired, caught glimpses of herself she no longer recognized. A bride trapped, a girl learning quickly that the rules of this world were not hers to dictate. Breakfast was a silent affair, consumed under the watchful gaze of both staff and, occasionally, Klassen himself, though he remained mostly absorbed in papers, his expression a mask of perfection. Mira observed him from across the table, noting the sharp lines of his jaw, the precise movements of his fingers, the way he sipped coffee, as if even the act required calculation. He was a man who ruled through fear, authority etched into every gesture, yet she couldn't shake the memory of that fleeting vulnerability she had glimpsed, the lingering touch, the hesitation that suggested something beyond control and power. The mansion imposed rules like an unspoken law: no wandering, no curiosity, no unsanctioned movement. Every door clicked closed with authority, every hallway monitored by unseen eyes, every glance measured and calculated. "Don't wander where you don't belong," Klassen warned once as she attempted to explore the northern wing. His tone was calm, deliberate, yet heavy with threat. Mira had nodded obediently, but inside, defiance bubbled quietly. The walls could contain her body, but they could not cage her curiosity. Days merged into a pattern of schedules, meetings, and observations. Mira learned the rhythm of the estate, the cadence of Klassen's habits, the exact moments when his presence could be felt and when it was absent. She began noting the inconsistencies, the rare instances when his stoicism faltered, the subtle gestures that betrayed a man more complicated than the public believed. Despite his deliberate detachment, there were cracks. And in those cracks, she sensed the beginnings of understanding, a dangerous, forbidden fascination. One evening, curiosity overcame caution. The mansion had grown quiet under the cover of darkness, the guards retreating to their posts, the servants extinguishing their lanterns one by one. Mira wandered, careful to avoid detection, her steps measured against the floor that could betray her. She moved past corridors lined with ancient portraits and massive mirrors, each reflecting not only her image, but the weight of history embedded in these walls. A soft glow drew her attention to the library doors, ajar just enough to reveal a sliver of light. Mira stepped closer, peering through the crack. There he stood, Klassen Vargo, rigid and solemn, staring at a cluster of framed photographs on his desk. His hand hovered over one of them, tremoring ever so slightly, betraying a vulnerability she had never seen before. The man who ruled empires with fear now seemed small, almost fragile, illuminated by the amber light of a single desk lamp. "You're not supposed to see this side of me," he muttered, voice low, almost vulnerable. The words were foreign to her ears, soft yet laced with warning. Mira's heartbeat quickened, her instincts torn between retreat and engagement. She whispered, almost defiantly, "Then stop showing it." His head snapped toward her, eyes blazing, a mixture of fury and curiosity colliding in a storm she had never witnessed. The sharpness of his gaze pinioned her in place, yet there was something beneath the anger, a hesitation, a question, a fear. For a man who commanded fear effortlessly, who had never shown weakness publicly, why did he now appear afraid? Mira could feel the intensity of the moment pressing down, a fragile equilibrium that threatened to shatter with a single word. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Mira's pulse raced as she waited, uncertain if she had crossed an invisible line. Klassen's hand lingered near the photographs, hesitant to move yet unwilling to hide them. Each photo was a fragment of his past, faces of people she did not know, smiles frozen in time, memories that seemed both sacred and haunted. The weight of the unknown pressed on her chest. What ghosts were trapped in this fortress of power, hidden behind these walls, haunting the man who appeared invincible to the world? Finally, Klassen's voice broke the tension, quieter, almost a whisper, yet sharper for its restraint. "Some things are meant to stay buried." He turned, the shadows of his expression shifting, as if war was raging behind the calm exterior. Mira's lips parted, words catching in her throat. The mansion had rules, yes, but these walls also held secrets that defied even her imagination. Night deepened. Mira lingered near the doorway, observing him, her curiosity undimmed by fear. Klassen moved with deliberate precision, straightening papers, adjusting frames, a ritual both meticulous and telling. She noticed small details, the way his fingers brushed the edges of a photograph, the fleeting softness in his eyes when he looked away from her. A man who could destroy empires in a thought was now quietly dismantled by memories. The realization unsettled her, made her wonder if the power he wielded externally was a shield for a man who carried burdens the world could not perceive. Her own emotions churned. Fear, fascination, intrigue, and a subtle, unwelcome pull of empathy tangled within her chest. She had been warned not to wander, not to pry. Yet the mansion itself seemed to invite her into its labyrinth of secrets, each room whispering hints of a past layered with tragedy and power. Mira realized that the rules of this world were more than schedules and security. They were the invisible chains that bound not only her, but also Klassen. The following days blurred into a silent game of observation. Mira noted the patterns, the exact hour he entered the study, the subtle ticks when he reviewed documents, the rare moments when his gaze softened, if only fleetingly, towards something that stirred memory or regret. Each discovery was both exhilarating and dangerous. Her fascination deepened even as the mansion's walls seemed to close in, its opulent corridors pressing her curiosity against the limits of discretion. She began testing boundaries in small ways, lingering near doors, pretending to read in hallways, moving deliberately within sight yet just beyond command. Klassen noticed. He did not confront her immediately, but she could feel the subtle tension building, an invisible tug-of-war played in silence. The air between them became charged with unspoken rules, a delicate dance where curiosity and control collided. One night, the storm outside mirrored the tension within the mansion. Rain pelted the windows, lightning cutting brief paths of light across the walls, illuminating the grandeur and the isolation alike. Mira found herself near the office once more, drawn by something she could not name. Klassen was there, alone, staring at photographs as if seeking answers that had long evaded him. The storm's rhythm seemed to echo the beat of her pulse, faster, more insistent. She stepped closer, her breath catching. "Why do you let the past linger like this?" she asked softly, careful not to startle him. He did not answer immediately, his eyes fixed on a photograph of a young boy smiling, the edges worn from time. Mira's heart thudded. What story was hidden behind that smile? What ghosts haunted the man who now commanded her life with both indifference and magnetism? Klassen finally spoke, voice low, heavy with unspoken history. "Because some ghosts define you more than any choice ever could." He turned sharply, his gaze meeting hers with intensity, demanding comprehension without explanation. Mira felt the weight of centuries of power, loss, and secrecy pressed down. A chill ran through her, a shiver that was both fear and intrigue. The night deepened further, shadows stretching long across the office, curling like secrets, desperate to remain hidden. Mira lingered, caught in the delicate balance between observation and intrusion. Each detail she noticed, the furrow of his brow, the trembling of his fingers, the subtle clench of his jaw, painted a portrait of a man far more complex than the public feared. For all his power, all his control, there existed a side of Klassen Vargo that was vulnerable, haunted, and unyieldingly human. Mira realized then that the mansion was not only a prison for her, it was a vault for his past, a fortress where memories were both protected and imprisoned. Every rule, every schedule, every locked door existed not merely to control her movements, but to guard him from the world that had shaped him into this untouchable figure. She withdrew silently, retreating into the shadows of the corridor, yet her mind raced with questions. Who were the faces in the photographs? What tragedies had molded this man who seemed to command fear effortlessly, yet carried such delicate burdens? Each unanswered question became a thread pulling her deeper into the maze of Klassen Vargo's world. The mansion, for all its opulence, no longer seemed only magnificent. It seemed alive, sentient, filled with echoes of laughter long past, cries long silenced, and secrets that had never seen the light of day. Mira understood, with both awe and trepidation, that the rules she followed were only the surface. Beneath the marble floors and gilded ceilings lay a history steeped in loss, power, and shadows that even Klassen himself could not fully escape. As dawn approached, Mira retreated to her chamber, the storm subsiding, leaving the world washed and gleaming, yet leaving her questions unresolved. Klassen remained in his office, alone, a solitary figure confronting ghosts she could only begin to imagine. And Mira, on the edge of comprehension, realized that the mansion's rules were more than discipline. They were the boundaries of a hidden world she had only just begun to navigate. She drifted into uneasy sleep, the weight of observation and curiosity pressing upon her chest. Her dreams were filled with corridors she had yet to explore, shadows she had yet to confront, and a man whose heart and past remained locked behind walls she longed to breach. And somewhere in that darkness, Klassen Vargo's own unease mirrored hers. A man who controlled empires trembled silently before memories that refused to die. Mira knew, even in her half-sleep, that the mansion held more than rules. It held secrets, and within those secrets lay the truth of the man she was forced to call husband. What ghost from his past was he hiding behind those walls? And would Mira be brave or reckless enough to uncover it? The mansion's corridors had never seemed busier than the night of the charity gala. Mira moved through them in a gown of deep sapphire, the fabric hugging her form while sparkling faintly under the chandelier lights. Every step was measured, graceful, rehearsed, an outward perfection masking the turmoil beneath. Klassen walked beside her, a living statue of poise and control, tailored suit sharp as his reputation. The two of them were a picture of wealth, power, and influence, the perfect couple for the cameras that blinked incessantly, capturing each fleeting smile. But behind that carefully constructed image, Mira could feel the tension radiating from him, a coiled wire of unease and focus. Every glance he cast was too precise, every touch she felt against her waist or shoulder carried a weight that wasn't tenderness, but strategy. She recognized the difference instantly, the difference between duty and desire, control and impulse. She felt as though she were dancing with a storm, one that could erupt at any moment, leaving chaos in its wake. Guests murmured, whispers floating through the opulent ballroom like silk scarves, compliments, envy, admiration, assumptions about the perfect union. Mira's lips curved into a polite smile, though her eyes betrayed the unease that churned within. Each greeting she gave was rehearsed, each nod meticulous. She caught herself noticing the subtle cracks in Klassen's composure, the quick clench of his jaw, the brief narrowing of his eyes when someone too curious approached too closely. The man who commanded respect and fear alike was not immune to scrutiny, even from the outside world. A senator stepped forward during the toast, raising a glass high above the crowd. "To the impeccable union of Klassen Vargo and Mira Vargo," he announced, voice loud and celebratory. Applause erupted around them. Klassen's grip on her waist tightened, almost painfully, as if trying to anchor himself in a moment that demanded pretense. Mira's breath caught. The touch was firm, unyielding, almost possessive, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. She looked up at him, daring to meet his eyes, but they were unreadable, sharp, calculating, a mask she could not penetrate. The night continued, a blur of champagne, handshakes, and smiles designed for the cameras. Mira noticed the way he occasionally flinched into particular remarks, the flicker of irritation when someone mentioned past alliances or rivalries. Every movement, every gesture was deliberate, commanded, rehearsed, and yet beneath the facade, she sensed something more, a man struggling to balance the weight of perception, his empire, and the hidden fragments of his own humanity. Later, in the privacy of their suite, Mira's curiosity overcame her restraint. "You didn't marry me to save my father," she said, voice steady but sharp, cutting through the quiet tension that hung in the room. Her eyes searched his, looking for a flicker of honesty, a crack in the armor he never let anyone breach. "You needed my name to protect your empire." Klassen remained silent for a long moment, the weight of unspoken truths pressing against the air. Finally, he replied, his voice low, measured, "Yes, this marriage keeps enemies guessing." There was no remorse, no pretense of affection, just truth laid bare, raw and undeniable. "And your heart?" she asked, her voice soft but firm, a challenge and a plea all at once. Klassen's silence was the answer. Mira felt the cold distance close in around her, a reminder of the transactional nature of their union. She turned away, her emotions a storm she could not yet name, anger, betrayal, and an inexplicable tug of fascination toward the man who remained a mystery, even as he dominated her world. Night fell heavy, and the gala's laughter and music became a distant echo as Mira retreated to the study, drawn by instinct rather than purpose. The room smelled faintly of old books and polished wood, a sanctuary in a house that offered few. And there he was, Klassen, alone, standing over a small, controlled fire in the fireplace, letters curling in the flames. His silhouette was dark, commanding, almost otherworldly against the orange glow. Mira's eyes widened. The letters, she realized, were not part of business. They were personal, intimate, secrets meant to be consumed by fire, destroyed before they could exist in the world. Klassen muttered under his breath, a woman's name slipping through on his lips. Mira didn't recognize it. She leaned closer, curiosity burning hotter than caution. Why did the name cause his voice to fracture, to tremble even for a fraction of a second? He seemed unaware of her presence, absorbed in the act of erasure, each letter a thread of memory severed from reality. Mira's pulse quickened. This was a side of him no one had seen, a fragment of vulnerability, grief, or guilt that he kept buried beneath layers of control and reputation. Why did he burn them? Why did her name not echo in these flames? And who was the woman whose memory could command such intensity from the untouchable Klassen Vargo? She stepped back, hiding in the shadows, her mind racing. This was more than curiosity. It was the first real glimpse into a world he never allowed anyone to see. Mira realized then that the man she was bound to by contract was also bound by his own past, tethered to memories that shaped his every decision, every movement, every cold smile he offered the world. The night deepened. Mira's thoughts collided, jealousy, intrigue, unease, and a strange sympathy she could not yet define. She imagined the life behind the letters, the laughter, the pain, the love, and the loss that Klassen had hidden so meticulously. Each speculation was a spark, igniting questions she could not yet answer and emotions she had no right to feel. Suddenly, a soft sound, a cough, the crackle of fire, made her flinch. Klassen had stopped, head bowed slightly, as though hearing a ghost only he could see. Mira's breath caught. She knew she had to retreat, yet she could not tear her eyes away. Every gesture he made, every flicker of emotion, was a revelation she wasn't prepared to face. In the quiet, Mira considered the implications. Was the woman he muttered a ghost of lost love? A connection severed by circumstance or betrayal? Or something more dangerous, something tied to the empire he had built? The questions weighed heavily, a suffocating presence in the elegant study. She slipped back to the hallway, careful to remain unseen, her mind spinning with theories. Klassen had allowed a glimpse into his humanity, yet had immediately returned to the control he wielded so effortlessly. The contrast was intoxicating and terrifying. Mira realized that she was not simply observing a man, she was witnessing a fortress unravel, brick by brick, in moments he could not hide from the past. The next morning, at breakfast, she watched him quietly. His demeanor was unchanged externally, rigid, controlled, authoritative, but she had seen beneath the surface. The man who smiled for cameras and enforced rules was also a man haunted, fragile in ways that frightened her even as they drew her closer. Mira's mind kept returning to the name he had whispered, the letters devoured by flames. Who was she? Why did Klassen's voice falter? And what did it mean for the life he shared with her now, bound by contract but unsettled by history? Each question gnawed at her, a quiet obsession that promised consequences she could not yet foresee. The mansion, in its grandeur and isolation, became both prison and theater, with Klassen the unyielding actor and Mira the unwilling observer. Their marriage, already a transaction, had been complicated by glimpses of human fragility, and the thin veil of civility was at risk of being torn apart by secrets, guilt, and unspoken longing. That night, Mira could not sleep. Images of Klassen burning letters, muttering names, and betraying even the smallest hint of vulnerability haunted her mind. The questions were relentless. Who was she? What did those letters mean? And why had Klassen, the untouchable, allowed such emotion to surface in the privacy of his study? Mira realized that the man behind the smile was far more complex than the public believed. The empire he controlled, the fear he wielded, and the power he exuded were all shields for something delicate and dangerous, and the flicker of emotion she had glimpsed in him, anger, sorrow, longing, or guilt, was enough to change the rules of their interaction, to force her curiosity into a dangerously personal territory. As she lay in her room, staring at the ceiling, she understood something with chilling clarity. This marriage was not just a deal. It was a maze, a battlefield of secrets, a landscape where control and vulnerability collided. And somewhere within those collisions, Mira felt the first stirrings of a truth she could neither define nor ignore. The man she married was a puzzle she had yet to solve, and his past was the key. Who was she? And why did his voice break saying her name? Could Mira ever trust a man whose empire was built on fear and whose heart remained veiled in shadows? The private jet hummed beneath them, a vessel of speed and detachment from the world that constantly observed Klassen Vargo and Mira. Their honeymoon, carefully orchestrated for maximum publicity, had been billed as a luxurious escape, a spectacle of love and elegance meant to dazzle the press and impress the world. Every detail, gilded furniture, sparkling champagne, the promise of romance, was calculated, and every step was followed by the lens of scrutiny, cameras capturing smiles and moments that never truly belonged to them. Mira leaned against the polished wall of the cabin, her sapphire gown brushing against the seat, her fingers absently tracing the delicate fabric. She felt trapped by the opulence, the curated image of bliss, and yet there was an undercurrent of rebellion stirring within her. For once, the cameras could not dictate her reactions, though her mind constantly measured and restrained her impulses. Klassen sat across from her, a storm in a tailored suit, his jaw rigid, his eyes reflecting the faint glow of the cabin lights. His hands clasped the armrest like a man trying to control more than the aircraft, trying to contain emotions he had long denied. The flight was smooth until the storm descended, a monstrous, unrelenting tempest that darkened the sky and twisted the ocean into fury lightning, illuminated the clouds like jagged teeth, thunder rolling beneath them, vibrating through the very bones of the jet. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but urgent. They would have to divert. Klassen's expression was unreadable, though the subtle tension in his shoulders betrayed him. The plan for publicity, for control, for appearances, was crumbling, leaving them alone in the eye of a storm they could neither predict nor command. When the jet touched down on his private island, the world of cameras and spectators vanished. Security personnel were trapped on the mainland by the storm, their reach severed. The estate, though lavish, was suddenly intimate, empty of pretense, absent of oversight. Mira moved barefoot across the marble floors of the villa, her feet silent against the cold, polished surface. It was a freedom she had not felt before, an almost dangerous vulnerability, as if every step carried the possibility of exposure, not to the world, but to the man she was learning to understand. Klassen retreated to his private study, the clink of glass and the warm amber hue of whiskey filling the room. He tried to drown the storm outside, and the one inside him, in alcohol, letting the liquid burn down his throat while he wrestled with thoughts he could neither command nor ignore. Mira watched from the doorway, her gaze steady, her presence unannounced yet undeniable. For all his attempts at control, he was incapable of dismissing her completely. She was harder to ignore than the fury of nature outside, harder than the jagged flashes of lightning that fractured the sky. "Still pretending this is business?" she asked, voice soft, teasing, yet charged with intent. Her words lingered in the air, challenging, questioning, daring him to respond without pretense. Klassen's hand froze mid-lift, the amber liquid catching the light. He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening, every inch of his body a study in restrained tension. "It has to be," he replied, his voice low, steady, but threaded with a restraint that barely contained something primal, something he refused to acknowledge. Mira stepped closer, her bare feet whispering against the floor. "Then stop looking at me like it's something else," she breathed, each word deliberate, intimate, carrying the weight of unspoken defiance. The air between them thickened, charged with desire, frustration, and the dangerous thrill of forbidden emotion. Klassen's composure cracked, his control slipping like sand through fingers. The storm outside mirrored the tempest within the room, a collision of power, restraint, and raw need. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with an urgency that left her breathless. Pulling her close, he pressed his lips to hers, not tenderly, but with a fierce intensity that was both defiance and surrender. Mira's heart raced, her mind spinning, caught between fear and exhilaration. The kiss was a declaration and a confession, a silent acknowledgement that the rules they had lived by were meaningless in this moment. She pressed against him, feeling the strength in his arms, the deliberate power he exuded, and yet the vulnerability lurking beneath. Klassen's restraint shattered completely, leaving only instinct and emotion, a collision of control and desire that neither had anticipated. The world, the deal, the cameras. They were gone, leaving only the truth that had always been impossible to admit aloud. They were drawn to one another in ways neither could fully command or resist. Hours passed unnoticed. The storm raged outside, echoing the intensity of their encounter, the sky and sea mirroring the chaos of emotions within the walls of the villa. Mira's hands traced the lines of his suit, feeling the rigid discipline beneath, while Klassen's fingers lingered. In ways that spoke of restraint, of fascination, of something dangerously tender. Each movement, each glance was a negotiation, a dialogue without words, a surrender neither wanted to fully name. Even in the quiet, their proximity was incendiary. Mira could feel the weight of his gaze, the tension in his breath, the subtle tremor in his fingers when they brushed against hers. Klassen was not a man who lost control easily, yet in this isolated space, stripped of rules, appearances, and spectators, he was a man undone by the presence of the woman who challenged him at every turn. "Why do you make it so difficult?" she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear, the warmth of her breath sending shivers through him. Klassen's answer was a low growl, a sound both warning and promise, his hands tightening slightly, asserting possession without words. Mira smiled faintly, daring him, challenging him, and reveling in the rare power she now held over his composure. They moved through the villa, each room a stage, each gesture a conversation of defiance and desire. Mirrors reflected their closeness, the storm's lightning tracing sharp lines across the polished floors, amplifying every heartbeat, every shiver, every breathless pause. Mira realized she had never truly felt seen, not like this, not by anyone who mattered, not by anyone who could alter the rules of her world and still let her choose to stay. Klassen paused in the grand hall, the rain hammering against the windows, lightning slicing the sky. His hands rested lightly on her waist, eyes dark, searching, testing the boundaries of control he had always maintained. Mira leaned into him, feeling the pulse of his body against hers, the struggle between restraint and surrender radiating from him in waves she could feel down to her bones. "You're dangerous," she murmured, lips near his ear, teasing, warning, and challenging all at once. Klassen's response was a silent one, closing the distance, tilting his head, a brush of teeth against hers, a kiss that claimed and questioned simultaneously. It was a surrender gnaw, either wanted to name, yet both acknowledged in the silence that followed. Minutes became hours, the storm outside unrelenting, echoing the rhythm of their closeness, the collision of desire, restraint, and fragile trust. Mira traced the lines of his face, memorizing the tension and softness in equal measure. Klassen's hands lingered, hesitated, withdrew, and returned. An endless dance of dominance and vulnerability, of defiance and admission. Neither spoke. Words were unnecessary. Their shared understanding, conveyed in glances, touches, and breaths, carried more weight than any vow, any agreement, any contract could contain. Mira realized that for the first time since this marriage had begun, the deal no longer mattered. The rules, the contracts, the business arrangements, they were irrelevant here. Only this moment, this island, this storm, and this man existed. Night faded into the tentative calm of dawn. The storm had spent itself, leaving a pale light through the grand windows, illuminating the traces of the previous night. Tangled hair, disheveled gowns, the lingering warmth of skin against skin. Mira lay quietly, heart still racing, aware of the delicate line they had crossed. Klassen sat near her, silent, the shadows of restraint returning, the mask of control reassembling itself as if the night's surrender had been an anomaly rather than a revelation. The morning light caught the edge of his gaze. For a moment, it softened, almost tender, almost human, but the mask quickly returned, the empire, the deal, the rules reclaiming their place. Mira wondered, in that quiet heartbeat, whether the intimacy they had shared would survive under the rigid rules of their world, or if it would be dismissed as a moment erased by the necessity of control. But when morning came, would he pretend it never happened? Would the night's surrender remain a secret? or had something irrevocable begun between them? Something that no storm, no deal, and no empire could ever fully erase. Morning broke over the Vargo estate like a pale knife, cutting through the remnants of the storm that had raged the night before. Light spilled into the grand bedroom, illuminating the silence and the fragile tension that clung to the air. Mira lay awake, every muscle taut, replaying the previous night's events in her mind. The warmth of Klassen's embrace, the defiance in his kisses, the raw surrender, none of it made sense against the rigid rules of their world. And yet it had happened. Undeniable, unrepeatable, and haunting. When Klassen appeared for breakfast, his presence was exacting, cold, and measured, as though nothing had occurred. The warmth of the villa felt hollow, stripped of intimacy by his controlled demeanor. Mira sat across from him, eyes observing, heart racing, daring to see if the vulnerability of last night had left any mark. She caught a fleeting glimpse in the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers drummed on the table, signals of restraint, guilt, or denial. "Last night was a mistake," Klassen said finally, voice sharp as steel, cutting through the breakfast room like a blade. Each word reverberated against her chest, leaving small fissures in the fragile equilibrium they had achieved. Mira's heart ached, a quiet, insistent pulse that demanded she respond with more than silence. "Then stop repeating it," she said, eyes steady but breaking inside, lips trembling imperceptibly, a subtle act of defiance and truth wrapped together. He didn't reply. Without another word, he rose from the table, leaving the chair spinning slightly, the air charged with his absence. Mira watched him go, the hollow click of his footsteps echoing in the marble halls. His departure left more than silence. It left a void, a fracture she could feel in every corner of her chest. She wondered how a man who could command empires, control fear, and manipulate power could allow a single night to unhinge him so completely. Days passed in a blur of formalities, eatings, and rehearsed smiles. Yet the memory of last night lingered between them, a silent current neither acknowledged. Mira threw herself into routines, walking the corridors of the mansion barefoot, observing, listening, and understanding the subtle codes of Klassen's world. And then the crack appeared, a rupture that no schedule, no distance could prevent. During a board meeting, a careless comment from one of Klassen's men, an insult veiled as jest, reached her ears. It was meant to provoke, to test, to unsettle. Mira felt it burn her from within, a flash of indignation and helplessness she could not contain. Before she could react, Klassen rose. The calm, measured mask of the Mafia king shattered like glass under pressure. His first punch was swift, a blur of controlled power unleashed without hesitation. The man who had insulted her crumpled, surprised, his body hitting the floor with a sound that resonated through the room. Klassen's second punch followed, deliberate, precise, and merciless, blood beginning to paint the polished floor. Mira's breath caught. This was the man she feared, the man she barely knew, the man whose love she had yet to feel, revealing the depth of his devotion through violence. The room fell silent. Witnesses froze, a mixture of shock and fear rooting them in place. Klassen's chest heaved, the controlled storm of power now raw and exposed, eyes blazing, voice low and dangerous. "No one touches her name," he growled, each word a warning, a declaration, a promise. Mira's heart thumped wildly, a blend of fear, awe, and something deeper she could not yet name. That night, the mansion felt different. Shadows stretched across the halls, distorted by flickering candlelight, echoing the chaos of the day. Mira moved cautiously, drawn to the corridor by instinct, guided by a sense she could not define. And there he was, slumped against the LD marble wall, blood staining his collar, his hands trembling slightly. He had fought to protect her honor, yet in the process had left himself vulnerable in ways no one had witnessed. Klassen. She studied him closely, noting every line of tension in his jaw, every clench of his fists, the subtle twitch in his eyes that revealed the depth of his struggle. He was a man who had built an empire from fear, who had mastered control over others, yet here, alone, he was undone by the weight of protecting her, by the raw intensity of emotions he could not name. For Mira, it was a revelation. The man who could command violence with ease, who could manipulate outcomes with a word, was also a man capable of tenderness and vulnerability, and that juxtaposition terrified her, drew her, and bound her closer in ways she could neither resist nor fully comprehend. Hours passed. The corridor grew colder, the shadows deeper. Mira remained, attentive, steady, ensuring he was unharmed beyond the obvious wounds. Klassen's hand, still holding hers, was a silent acknowledgement. He could not hide from her, not now, not when she had seen the man beneath the mask. A faint noise startled them, a creak in the corridor, a shift of shadows, and Mira's pulse quickened. Klassen tensed, eyes scanning the darkness, every muscle coiled for action. The mansion, usually predictable and controlled, now felt alive, a stage for danger, desire, and revelations that neither could ignore. In that quiet tension, Mira realized something profound. The fractures between them, the moments of defiance, the sparks of intimacy and confrontation were all part of the same truth. The deal, the contract, the rules, they were meaningless against the intensity of what they felt. And yet, the world outside remained, waiting, watching, demanding adherence to appearances, leaving them to navigate this fragile, dangerous, emotional landscape in secret. Klassen finally spoke, voice low, measured, carrying the weight of everything unsaid. "You shouldn't be here," he said, though the grip on her hand betrayed a contraction. Mira's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "And yet I am, because some truths are worth defying rules for." Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. The corridor, the shadows, the night, they all bore witness to a moment neither had planned, neither could ignore, and neither could retreat from without consequence. Was hate the only emotion powerful enough to hide love? Could their growing connection survive the walls they had built around themselves, or would the fires they had ignited consume them both? The mansion had never felt quieter, nor the air heavier, than the morning Mira returned from her doctor's appointment. Her fingers trembled as she held the small white card, the word on it impossible to ignore: pregnant. The news struck her like a physical blow, a mixture of joy, disbelief, fear, and something deeper, something she could not yet name. Her heart thumped erratically, each beat echoing against her ribs, a reminder that nothing in her life had prepared her for this. She sat alone in the sunlit bedroom, the curtains swaying faintly with the breeze, and let the reality of the situation sink in. She traced the card with delicate fingers, almost afraid that the sensation would make it vanish, that the fragile new life it represented could somehow be taken back by the cruel world she had inherited through marriage. Mira's mind raced. How would Klassen react? What would this mean for the deal, for their contract, for the fragile trust and fragile connection they had been building through fire and conflict? Days passed in silence. Mira kept the secret close, hiding the evidence and her growing anxiety behind calm smiles and rehearsed composure. She moved through the mansion like a ghost, her thoughts consumed by the life growing inside her and by the man whose empire and heart remained largely a mystery. Every glance at Klasse, nay, every subtle change in his mood sent a tremor through her, both of fear and a budding, forbidden hope. But secrets, Mira knew, had a way of revealing themselves. Klassen discovered the test in the bin one evening, his presence looming in the doorway before she could hide it completely. He picked it up slowly, examining it with the meticulous attention of a man who controlled everything but could not control the unexpected. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, thick with tension and unsaid questions. "You should have told me," he said finally, voice low, raw, carrying an edge of pain she had never heard directed at her before. His eyes, usually sharp and unreadable, were wide, flickering with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Mira's breath caught in her throat, and she realized that for once the unyielding Klassen Vargo had no immediate strategy, no instant control over his emotions. Would it have mattered? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling with the weight of the truth and the fear of his reaction. She searched his face, searching for a sign of anger, for disdain, for anything that could hint he would see this as a betrayal rather than a miracle. A child wasn't part of the deal, he replied finally, voice clipped but heavy with unspoken layers. His jaw tightened, eyes flicking away briefly, as if to hide the turmoil stirring within him. Mira's gaze softened, her lips curving into a faint, ironic smile despite the fear twisting inside her. Neither was love, she whispered, letting the words hang in the air between them, challenging him, daring him to confront the truth he had long tried to bury. Klassen's face changed imperceptibly, like a storm shifting beneath a rigid exterior. Anger folded into something unguarded, a raw vulnerability that startled Mira even as it drew her closer. His sharp features softened, and for a fleeting moment, he seemed not like the untouchable Mafia king, but a man confronting the immensity of responsibility, emotion, and fear he could no longer deny. Mira, I can't lose control again, he said, voice rough, filled with a mixture of warning and confession. His hands curled slightly, tightening against his sides, as though the act of standing still required a monumental effort. The mansion seemed to hold its breath, the usual echoes of luxury replaced by the quiet resonance of an unspoken truth. Then stop pretending you ever had it, she replied, her voice steady, eyes unwavering, challenging the walls he had built around himself. She reached out, letting her fingers brush against his arm lightly, an act of defiance and comfort, a bridge between fear and trust. For the first time, his silence did not sound powerful. It did not command respect or fear. It sounded small, human, scared. Mira noticed the flicker of hesitation, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes avoided hers, not out of malice but out of uncertainty, vulnerability, and fear. It was a sound and presence that unnerved her, yet drew her in closer, closer than she had ever allowed herself. The hours stretched on, and Mira found herself pacing the corridors, each step a mix of anticipation and dread. She could hear the faint hum of his study in the distance, the sound of his breathing, deliberate, measured, yet lacking the certainty he usually exuded. She wondered if he was planning, scheming, or simply processing the revelation of a life he had never anticipated. When she entered the study, he did not look up immediately. Klassen sat behind the massive mahogany desk, fingers clasped together, knuckles white, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. Mira felt the weight of his stare when he finally lifted his gaze, a combination of curiosity, fear, and something deeper that she could not yet name. He began, then faltered. The unshakable command in his voice, the authority that had intimidated so many, was gone. Mira approached cautiously, sensing the rare fragility beneath his usual veneer. She perched at the edge of the desk, her hand brushing lightly against his, anchoring herself, and perhaps him. "The world expects us to be predictable," he muttered finally, voice low, thoughtful, and vulnerable. "To act within the confines of expectation, of strategy, of control. But this changes everything." His eyes bore into hers, searching, weighing, questioning. Mira's pulse quickened. She leaned closer, letting the subtle warmth of her body communicate what words could not. "It does," she admitted softly. "But not everything that changes is bad." Her voice carried reassurance, challenge, and hope, all intertwined. They remained like that, hours passing in silence punctuated only by small movements, a tilt of the head, a shift in weight, the subtle brush of hands against the polished desk. Every gesture, every hesitation, every flicker of expression became a dialogue, a conversation of hearts and fears that had never had words before. Mira felt the enormity of their situation, a life growing inside her, a man incapable of complete control, and the fragile possibility of love amidst fear, empire, and chaos. The stakes were higher than any deal, higher than any contract, higher than any plan, meticulously crafted by Klassen Vargo. And yet, despite the uncertainty, Mira's courage grew. She could see the human beneath the armor, the vulnerability beneath the power, the capacity for fear and love coexisting in ways that frightened and fascinated her. She realized that the pregnancy, the secret she had guarded, was not just a challenge, it was a revelation, a catalyst, and perhaps the only force that could alter the balance of their fractured marriage. The evening shadows crept across the study, stretching long and dark, echoing the magnitude of what had been revealed. Klassen remained silent, yet every muscle, every twitch, every flicker of his expression communicated the inner turmoil he could not yet voice. Mira understood that he was at war with himself, with the past, and with a future that demanded surrender of control he had never relinquished before. Was he protecting her, or protecting himself from her? Could the man who ruled through fear and strategy ever embrace a vulnerability so intimate, so permanent, so terrifying? And could Mira navigate the delicate line between truth, love, and survival without losing herself in the process? The news traveled faster than any announcement could hope to. By mid-afternoon, the empire that Klassen Vargo commanded with an iron grip was buzzing with whispers. The Mafia king is expecting an heir. Offices, streets, and allies alike spread the word like wildfire, and with the revelation came vulnerability. Enemies who had long waited for a crack in his armor now smelled opportunity. Mira sat in the sunlit corner of the study, the announcement echoing in her mind. The weight of the secret she had carried alone, the life growing within her, now threatened to turn their world upside down. Klassen's presence beside her was normally a shield, but today it was a tense reminder that power and danger walked hand in hand. She noticed the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way his hands curled around the desk, the rigid line of his shoulders, preparation, anticipation, and barely controlled fury. By evening, the mansion was cloaked in a false sense of serenity. Lights glimmered in grand hallways, servants moved silently, and the air smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive candles. But the peace was fragile, a brittle veneer over a storm waiting to erupt. Mira's intuition prickled, the knowledge that danger was coming pressing against her chest like ice. Klassen moved through the halls silently, every step deliberate, every glance calculating, a living guardian ready to respond to any threat. The first sound of gunfire shattered the delicate silence. Bullets tore through marble walls, splintering wood and shattering glass. The magasin's mansion erupted into chaos. Mira screamed, instinct propelling her toward the nearest cover, but Klassen was faster. His arm swept around her, pulling her down to the polished floor, just as another round tore through the chandelier above. The world became a cacophony of sound. Glass shattering, screams echoing, gunfire ringing relentless against the walls. "Stay down!" he barked, his voice a mix of command and desperation. Mira pressed against him, heart hammering, eyes wide with fear as she felt the impact of bullets grazing walls and furniture, the vibrations traveling through the marble floor. Klassen's body shielded hers, every movement a testament to instinct and devotion. She realized, in that instant, that his formidable presence was more than power. It was protection, fierce and unyielding. One bullet, precise and cruel, found its mark. Klassen gasped, a sharp intake of air, and Mira felt the heat of his blood seeping through her fingers as she instinctively reached for him. "No!" she screamed, pressing against his shoulder, disbelief and terror coursing through her. "You can't leave me now!" Her voice cracked, the sound echoing through the chaos of the mansion. He coughed, a weak, strained sound, voice rasped with pain. "You were never supposed to matter," he whispered, barely audible, eyes locking with hers. There was no pride in his gaze, only vulnerability, raw and human. Mira's tears fell freely, burning her cheeks as she pressed herself closer, unwilling to accept the truth of his fragility, of his mortality. "Then why are you dying for me?" she screamed, her voice a mixture of rage, despair, and desperate love. Her hands clutched him, trying to stem the blood, trying to hold him in a world that suddenly seemed too violent and too fragile for them both. Klassen's lips curved faintly, almost imperceptibly, a shadow of a smile, his eyes fluttering shut despite the chaos around them. The sirens in the distance were a promise of aid, but their approach was slow, almost cruelly deliberate. Mira held him tight, rocking gently, whispering words that would air as much for herself as for him. Please, stay with me. Please don't leave me. Please, live for us, for our child. Her hands trembled, fingers slick with blood, pressing against the wound in a futile attempt to hold him to life. Klassen's strength faltered, every breath shallow, the pulse in his neck weak but steady. Mira's panic grew as she searched for a solution, her mind racing through every scenario, every option. The weight of responsibility, love, and fear pressed against her chest, making it almost impossible to breathe. She could feel the life within her stirring, a fragile heartbeat tethering her to hope, even as terror clawed at her. Outside, the storm of gunfire and chaos continued. Shadows flitted across the walls as enemies moved through the mansion with lethal precision. Mira's eyes, wide with fear and determination, followed every movement, noting the cracks in their attackers' formation, the points of vulnerability, the impossible odds stacked against them. Klassen shifted slightly, groaning, and Mira's heart leapt. He reached a trembling hand up, brushing her cheek lightly, a gesture of connection amidst the carnage. "Mira," he whispered, voice faint, yet threaded with something deeper than words. Trust, love, surrender. She pressed her forehead against his, tears mingling with blood, a moment of fragile intimacy in a night of violence. Gunfire erupted closer, splinters of marble and wood scattering across the hall. Mira's fear intensified, every instinct screaming to protect both her child and the man whose life she now depended on. Klassen's arm wrapped around her, pulling her even closer, sacrificing himself without hesitation to shield her from the storm of bullets. The ferocity of his protection left her shaken, awed, and terrified all at once. Minutes stretched like hours. Each second was a battle of willpower, fear, and survival. Mira P. rested her hand against his chest, feeling the rapid, uneven beat of his heart, whispering encouragement, pleading for him to endure. Klassen's lips barely moved, a faint smile against the crimson streaks on his face, as though mocking the cruelty of the night while holding on to the fragile thread of life. The mansion itself seemed to hold its breath, the air charged with tension, danger, and raw emotion. Mira's mind raced, calculating escape routes, imagining the next steps, all while holding on to him, unwilling to let the world take him from her. The weight of the revelation, their child, their bond, the life they were creating, pressed against every fiber of her being, making her desperate, vigilant, and painfully alive. In a moment of horrifying stillness, one attacker slipped past the cover of shadows. Mira's scream rang out as the man raised his weapon. Klassen, despite the blood and pain, shifted with a speed that belied his weakened state, knocking the assailant aside, taking another blow himself in the process. Mira's arms tightened around him, refusing to let go, refusing to accept a world where he could be taken. Time blurred. Sirens grew louder, mingling with the echoes of gunfire and screams. Mira's heart pounded, caught between hope and despair. Klassen's eyes met hers one final time before the paramedics' arrival, a silent exchange of love, apology, and promise. The warmth of his hand lingered, his pulse faint but stubborn, refusing to succumb entirely to the darkness threatening to claim him. Would he survive long enough to see the life they'd created? Could the Empire, the danger, and the relentless tide of enemies finally be held at bay long enough for them to exist, not as victims of circumstance, but as a family bound by blood, love, and defiance? The first rays of sunlight crept slowly through the blinds of the hospital room, painting the walls in soft gold and illuminating the quiet hum of life within. Machines beeped rhythmically, a gentle reminder of survival, of continuity, and of the fragile balance that had brought them to this mom. Mira lay in the bed, her hand cradling her rounded belly, her breathing steady but weighted with exhaustion, relief, and hope. Klassen stirred, eyelids fluttering open to meet the light. For the first time in weeks, the world felt almost gentle, almost ordinary, a stark contrast to the chaos, blood, and storms they had survived. His gaze fell on Mira immediately, the soft curve of her hair against the pillow, the faint sheen of tears that had dried on her cheeks, the quiet strength emanating from her very presence. He whispered, almost to himself, "Still here." Mira smiled through the lingering tears, her eyes crinkling with a mixture of weariness and unrestrained joy. "Where else would I be?" she replied softly, her voice carrying warmth, love, and the quiet authority of someone who had endured fear, loss, and survival. Klassen's lips twitched in the faintest semblance of a smile, a foreign softness washing over features that had long been hardened by control, pain, and power. He reached for her hand, careful, deliberate, and yet trembling slightly, a gesture of connection, reassurance, and acknowledgement of a bond forged through fire. "The deal's over, Mira," he murmured, his voice low, sincere, almost reverent. Mira's heart lifted, a quiet exhale escaping her lips as she responded, "Finally, because love isn't business." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of all they had endured, yet buoyant with promise. Klassen laughed weakly, the sound strange to both of them, but beautiful in its rarity. It was not the laughter of power, command, or dominance. It was the laughter of relief, intimacy, and unguarded humanity. Mira reached for him, fingers brushing his hand as if to anchor the moment, to remind both of them that despite the deals, threats, and chaos, something authentic had survived. Outside, the world continued, reporters still whispering of contracts, alliances, and the calculated decisions of the Vargo Empire. But within these walls, in this sunlit sanctuary, those words held no weight. They could not quantify the nights of fear, the battles fought, or the moments of vulnerability and love that had unfolded between them. This was theirs alone, unmeasured, undeniable, and eternal. Klassen's hand moved gently over her stomach, the gesture tender, reverent, and protective all at once. His voice, barely more than a breath, whispered, "Guess this is one rule we both broke." Mira pressed her hand over his, a shared acknowledgement of rebellion, surrender, and defiance. They had broken rules, shattered expectations, and rewritten the boundaries of love and loyalty in ways that could never be undone. The memory of nights spent under the storm, the relentless gunfire, and the fear of losing him pulsed in her mind. Yet the contrast now, the quiet, the warmth, the safety of this room, made every hardship, every battle, every tear feel purposeful. Every moment had led to this fragile, luminous peace, a peace earned through blood, courage, and devotion. They lingered in silence, letting the weight of survival settle around them. Klassen's eyes studied Mira, tracing the curve of her face, the depth of her gaze, the resilience etched into every line. He realized, perhaps fully for the first time, that power, empire, and control had never been sufficient to define him. Love, raw, complicated, and terrifying, was a force far greater than any currency or contract could measure. Mira, in turn, felt his presence not as a source of fear or obligation, but as a quiet anchor, a steady heartbeat amidst the chaos that life had thrown at them. She leaned closer, pressing her forehead to his, and whispered the truth they had both feared to acknowledge aloud. "We survived, we're still here, and we have a life to protect, a life that begins with this moment." Klassen nodded, voice rough but filled with clarity. "A life with you," he added, the words simple yet weighted with the gravity of emotion he had spent so long denying. Mira smiled faintly, tears welling once more, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming relief, love, and hope coursing through her. Outside, the hospital world moved on, unaware of the battles fought within these walls. But inside, every heartbeat, every breath, and every shared glance was a declaration that the past, blood, fire, deals, and betrayal, had given way to a new future. A future written not by contracts or expectations, but by choice, love, and resilience. Mira shifted slightly, placing her hand atop Klassen's, guiding it over her belly, feeling the life growing within. "He or she will know your strength," she whispered, half teasing, half reverent, a smile tugging at her lips. Klassen's hand trembled slightly under hers, reverent, protective, almost afraid to touch, yet desperate to connect. They stayed like that for hours, time dissolving around them. No words were needed beyond soft murmurs, gentle touches, and the quiet assurance that, at last, they had rewritten the rules of their lives together. Every scar, every battle, every night of uncertainty and fear was part of the tapestry that had brought them here. Klassen finally spoke, voice low, thoughtful, and filled with a vulnerability reserved only for Mira. "Some deals," he began, pausing as if savoring the weight of the words, "are written not in ink, but in blood and devotion." Mira's eyes met his, tears shining in the soft light, and she nodded, understanding the full depth of his meaning. They laughed softly, a shared sound of relief, intimacy, and connection. No empire, no press, no contract could claim them or the life they had chosen. The mansion, the danger, and the chaos had receded, replaced by something tender, enduring, and unshakable. The baby kicked gently, startling them both, a small, miraculous reminder that life persisted even in the aftermath of violence, chaos, and fear. Klassen's hand pressed against her stomach again, this time with awe, reverence, and a quiet sense of responsibility that softened the hardened edges of the man who had once ruled. Through fear, Mira's heart swelled. She felt the full circle of their journey, the fear, the storm, the chaos, the surrender, and finally the peace that came from surviving together. Every trial had led to this sanctuary, every moment of defiance had forged the trust, and every tear had been a testament to endurance. As the sun climbed higher, spilling light over the hospital room, Klassen and Mira held hands, eyes locked, hearts entwined. No words were necessary beyond the quiet affirmation that they had survived, they had fought, and they had chosen each other above all else. And some deals are truly written not in ink, contracts, or law, but in the deepest sacrifices, the fiercest devotion, and the enduring love that binds hearts beyond fear, chaos, and empire. Theirs was a promise rewritten, unbreakable, and eternal. Love wasn't part of the deal, but it became the only thing that kept them alive. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Heartwoven Tales. Press the bell icon and be ready, because our next tale will prove some hearts are born to break every rule.